Bufo Marinus here on the Toad Cam. Finally, sun. Been dealing with these crappy, horrible, rainy days. Very bad for photography. Okay, what's on our hot list? On being certain. See if the sun won't zap that. On Being Certain by Robert A. Burton. This is a very, very, very important book for us nulpers. And it covers a lot of ground, but the ground it covers is arranged around a concept that we have a fundamental, and he would call it an irreducible sense of the feeling of knowing, which means that there's something in us. It's like an instinctive response that tells us that we're right. It's kind of a built-in dogmatism module. Yeah, right. Who would have thunk it? We've got actually somewhere in here, I guess they can MRI that or SPECT scan it or something and find that down there in our brain there is part of its structure is designed to insist that we're right about things. So it's kind of like an I am right because I'm right structure in your brain. And he looks at a lot of different manifestations of this thing he calls process, zap that. Process he calls the feeling of knowing. And the feeling of knowing is an intrinsic sense of rightness or correctness, truthfulness, certainty, all of the above. And he studies some disorders, some psychological disorders that occur rarely. They're very fascinating. They're called the delusional misidentification disorders, which really highlight this problem. These are disorders that include something called the Cotard syndrome, which is the belief that one is dead or a corpse. And we know a lot of these NLP stories, corpses bleed or corpses have heartbeats. That idea that one is not alive, that one is somehow existing in the world as a non-living being, is known as the Cotard syndrome. There's another one called the Fragoli syndrome. And the Fragoli syndrome is really funny. It's a belief that people you don't know, you've never met, you've never seen them before, are actually friends or relatives or people who are intimate to you who are just going under some very sophisticated disguise. And so someone with Fragoli may walk up to another person on the street who he or she has never met and insist that this person is, say, his grandfather or brother or friend or somebody he knew in school. The flip syndrome is Capgras syndrome. And Capgras syndrome is also called the imposter syndrome, which means that you believe that either persons or physical objects that are very familiar to you have been replaced by imposters. And the real wife or parent or whatever is either being sequestered in a warehouse or kept hidden away or living a life someplace else. And this imposter, who is this perfect replica of one's intimate friend or wife or whatever, has taken over. And this also extends to physical objects. So people with the Capgras syndrome can believe that some physical thing that they are intimately familiar with, that's been part of their life, has been replaced by, we don't know by whom, with a precise replica that in every way resembles it. It just doesn't have the sort of essence of being of the thing. It's a really interesting piece of phenomenology. It's kind of like the brain is doing weird phenomenology. All right, well, that's cool. So these syndromes are indicative of something in the mind that can become absolutely fixated on the idea of its truthfulness or its rightness with no evidence whatsoever, yet the stuff around seems to somehow support this belief. So what I would suggest is, if you get some time, this is not a terribly long book. It's pretty good. It's about 220 pages, more or less. But it's very, very basic to what we're doing here. It's kind of like, okay, well, look, if you go read phenomenology, say if you read something like Robert Sokolovsky's Introduction to Phenomenology, you realize the phenomenologists are people who are just trying to do brain science without brain science tools, okay? So when you pick up something like Burton, we've seen Burton, he did that little lecture I posted at Google, on the Google campus. He was an interesting speaker. But anyway, if you read Burton, is that visible now? On being certain, believing you were right even when you were not. You'll find out pretty quickly, especially if you're cross-reading this with phenomenology, that the philosophical domain of phenomenology is very rapidly being replaced by neuroscience, because neuroscience is doing phenomenology better than philosophy. And NLP is caught kind of strangely between these two sides. Over here, NLP is kind of a bastard child of phenomenology, and over here, do either kind of expand out and kind of check in with phenomenology and where it's coming from, and neuroscience and where it's coming from, or just kind of stew in our own juices for a while. But go read Burton. Your mind will be improved thereby.